as the US is pulling back, how can we then use that moment to then, maybe advance some of the similar kinds of values and support governance in Southeast Asia through a coordinated think tank strategy?
I think the biggest question for Indonesian is like whether there is a commitment for Australia to actually be in Southeast Asia when push comes to shove.
You're listening to the National Security Podcast, the show that brings you expert analysis, insights and opinion on the national security challenges facing Australia and the Indo-Pacific, produced by the ANU National Security College.
Welcome to the National Security Podcast. I'm David Andrews, Senior Manager for Policy and Engagement at the ANU National Security College. Today's podcast is being recorded on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. This week I'm joined by Natalie Sambhi and Yohanes Sulaiman for an in-depth look at Indonesia, both as one of Australia's most significant international relationships, but as an evolving and consequential strategic actor in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. We've also recently celebrated the 80th anniversary of Indonesia's independence, which was declared on the 17th of August 1945, so what better time than now for this conversation? Dr. Natalie Sambhi is the founder and executive director of Verve Research, an independent think tank focused on Southeast Asia, as well as a senior policy fellow with Asia Society Australia and a non-resident fellow with the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program. Associate Professor Yohanes Sulaiman is Associate Professor in International Relations at Universitas Jenderal Achmad Yani in Indonesia and a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research in the United States. He is also the executive editor of the Journal of Global Strategic Studies. Natalie and Yohanes, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, David.
Glad to be here.
Well, as I've just mentioned, we've just ticked over the 80th anniversary of Indonesia's independence, and in a couple of months' time, it'll be a year since President Prabowo assumed office. So this seemed to me like a good time to look more closely at this relationship. So, Yohanes, could you perhaps start off for us by sharing your impressions of President Prabowo's foreign and defence policies so far? How would you characterise his international outlook?
Well, his international outlook, in my opinion, is pretty much chaotic, if I can use the words. I already see Natalie is kind of like cringing, like, oh my God, here we go again. But Prabowo in beginning seems to have a very, really high ambition. Like he wants to be like the global peacemaker. He wants to be like the global statesman coming to Washington, Beijing, Moscow and get red carpet treatment all over the place. Well, that's fine. Everybody has that kind of ambition. Especially if you look at what's happened today in international politics. We have and then. Of course, Indonesia, with its stature, with its strategic geopolitical position, is actually in the right time and place to do so. But the problem is, I just don't see any methods. Like, what's the strategic goal of all the visits? He went to Moscow and then he went and Beijing and Washington. Like, for what? Of course, like he said, I made a lot of deals. I made a deal with Washington. I made a deal with Trump. I made a deal with Putin and et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is, again, talk is cheap. The problem is, where's the beef? Like, okay, what's the purpose of us going all over the place? What's the purpose of Prabowo going to the Middle East, going to like all this his global thoughting tour all over the place? Like, why? What's our strategic goal? Like, why should I care? I think that's that's why I call it chaotic, because there is just no logic except the fact that he wants to be seen as a global peacemaker. That's it.
Actually, would you concur with that judgment, or would you like to provide a different perspective?
Yeah, no, I'm gonna side with Yohanes on this one. Yohanes says like talk is cheap. I reckon talk is really expensive in this case. That's taxpayers' money funding all of these, not only Prabowo, but his entire entourage, right? So I agree with you.
Yeah.
The way I see it, he's got a seat at the table. And I would be expecting as an emerging middle power like Indonesia with these grand ambitions that he's got, like love the energy. Like energy, can't fault that. But where I would expect like a leather-bound dossier of a nice, well-thought-out strategy, you get back-of-the-napkin solutions. And that's the kind of thing, that's the other unfortunate energy that I can see, that there is this ambition there, as Yohanes talked about. But I agree, it's chaotic because there are just ideas thrown out, a couple of years ago, Shangri-La, there was a peace plan between Ukraine and Russia. Let's do it. Now there's going to be another peace plan between Israel and the Palestinians. Let's do it. But there's nothing behind it. There is an idea of having the seat at all these different tables. I can see recently he's going to be at Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the summit at the end of this month. Yeah, fair, like other Southeast Asian leaders. He's now got a seat at BRICS. He's now hanging out with Russia. He's the guest of honor at India's National Day. He's guest of honor at the National Day in France. But to what end? Are these actually delivering material outcomes, or is it just spending taxpayers' money and cutting into other elements of the national budget in order to be seen? And I think, to defend that on another hand, like to be seen as a quality of its own, but I think it's much more powerful to be seen when you've got really well-developed ideas, when you've got an idea of what you want the new world order to look like, or what Indonesia's place will be, or if you're reaching out to show civil society that Indonesia has public goods to offer as well. But I haven't quite seen that yet.
I think the things that I suppose have probably resonated the most, maybe in Australia or sort of, let's say, the West more broadly, have probably connected more to the Indonesia-Russia relationship as much as anything else, in terms of whether that's sort of their stance on the Russia-Ukraine war or maritime exercises with Russia, all sort of things that have happened relatively quickly in this first year that Prabowo has been president. But do you get the sense, Natalie, that there's any sort of continuity from his time as defence minister under Jokowi to now, or has there been quite a distinct break between those two periods of his approach to international affairs?
Yeah, I think I would say two things to that. I think there is a sense of continuity. I just want to pick up quickly on that Russia thing. I think that was blown out of disproportion in the Australian media. Yes, it's something to pay attention to, Indonesia's relationship with Russia. But, I mean, Yohanes will probably confirm this historically. When we've looked at the relationship between Indonesia and the Soviet Union, that has been long-standing. There's been defense industrial, it flows towards Indonesia with Russian equipment. There's been other kinds of technical and scientific cooperation over the years, maybe not as much as other countries. But I think, to see that blown up in the Australian media was perhaps missing the broader context of Indonesia's strategic relationships with a whole manner of different partners. So I just want to flag that. In terms of the continuity with Defence Minister, I think Prabowo out in front, racking up frequent flyer points is the part of continuity I see. The new element to that is Prabowo taking personal charge of a whole number of other portfolios, and I'm not sure how sustainable that is. You can argue that him installing Sugiono as the foreign minister, someone who's not got a diplomacy background, has allowed Prabowo a lot more latitude. Prabowo reportedly took a lead in the trade negotiations in achieving a deal with the American president as well. These are not sustainable, but these are also a mark of someone who wants very tight control over all of these portfolios. And not necessarily someone with the negotiation skills. Yes, if he achieved a deal, but was that the best deal for Indonesia? And we can go more into the details of that later, but that's just kind of what I see. I see a president who is very, very hands-on, and I would argue almost too hands-on.
Natalie got it right. There is some sort of like a strategic relation with Indonesia and Russia, and it has been ongoing since 1950s, although it has its ups and downs. And of course, if you talk to many people, many politicians in Indonesia still have a very soft spot to Russia because apparently they are helping us against imperialism. They look at the rosy eyeglasses of like what happened during Sukarno, where Indonesia was like this big power. We were like everybody afraid of us, the Russians, the United States, and Australia. Everybody was afraid of us. And Russia was one of our supporters back in the days. Remember when we tried to take back Papua from the Dutch? They supplied us with a lot of bombers and submarines and whatever. And of course, that nobody's kind of mentioned that Russia didn't give them to us for free. It was very expensive. But of course, nobody remember that. Everybody keeps saying that, oh yeah, Russia is our best friend, whatever. You can look at what Megawati, one of the biggest leader of one of the biggest party in Indonesia, said. So there is always a rush of fear making Indonesia some sort of like very soft. But at the same time, like Natalie said, we have to really be very careful in saying that Indonesia is in Russia's orbit, like I mean, if you look at Indonesia-United States relation, I mean, it is actually, I think, in my opinion, is far stronger than Indonesian-Russian. But and of course, Indonesia always consider like if we get too close to Russia, what will happen with our relation with the United States? I mean, whether there will be embargo or whatever. So that's always at the back. But and then of course the training with Russia is already like a plan that you have to see to compare it to Indonesia, Australia, and Indonesia, United States military exercises, which is far bigger. I mean, if you compare Indonesia-Russian relation exercises, military exercises with the United States, Indonesia, Australia exercise, I mean, it is like comparing a whale to minnow. I mean, that's my opinion, of course. But you have to look at it from this perspective. Like, there is always some sort of like Russophile elements in Indonesian politics, but at the same time, I think we really need to be very careful in overestimating the ties. Okay, so it's more complimenting what Natalie said rather than like, it's saying that, Natalie's wrong now.
No.
Thanks, man.
And I think, thank you. I think in both cases, that's a really useful point of clarification. And I think that's part of what I'm hoping to, I suppose, take out of our conversation is to maybe dispel some of these misperceptions and misunderstandings around Indonesia's foreign policy outlook, but also the way that Australia and other states can view that relationship is that, that as you say, Natalie, there was, I think we're all getting dozens of media requests to talk about sort of bombers in Papua or naval exercises with Russia and things, but actually it needs to be viewed in this bigger and more long-standing sort of context of relationship that Indonesia's had. And so that's something that I thought would be useful for us to extrapolate on a little bit is that, I guess, that sense of how Indonesia's foreign policy and security policies have evolved over this sort of 80 years of independence, and whether what we're seeing now is sort of, I guess, on that continuum, or whether this is maybe a change of pace or change of circumstance from where we're looking at before. I mean, obviously the notion of non-alignment is a long-standing principle within Indonesian foreign policy, and we talk about the Bandung Conference. Of course, that's in Indonesia, going back to the non-aligned movement in the 1950s. But are we still looking at Indonesia as truly non-aligned, or is it perhaps more multi-aligned or something different altogether, do you think?
Yeah, it is as a continuum. I mean, if you look at Indonesia-Russian relation, it is actually more as a counterbalance against Indonesia-China, Indonesia-United States relations, in the sense like we don't want to be seen as too close to the United States. We also don't want to be seen as too close to China, and there's also question of escalating conflict. So Russia is basically a useful third country that if we get embargoed by the United States, then we can buy our weaponry from Russia. And of course, nowadays there are lots of talk about China selling us weaponry, but there are also an opposition of us getting too close to China in terms of the military, because like it or not, China is a problem. I mean, if you look at what happened in China, in South China Sea, nobody in the, maybe I need to go out more, but nobody that I know in the Indonesian military really saying that, we have to go gung-ho for China. No, most of them are actually very, very cautious of us having too close relation with China. I mean, because like it or not, China is always a threat. So Russia see it as a kind of like a neutral third party that can be useful to balance our interests against China or United States. I mean, that's, I think, is still part of our independent active foreign policy, that we just don't want to get too close to any Kremlin. I mean, that's my take anyway.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna back up my friend here again. I mean, the way I see it, within Indonesia, we kind of have to disaggregate that in a little bit. If we just look at the strategic side of things, even within Indonesia's strategic community, even between some of the players in foreign policy, in intelligence, in the military, within the military itself, different parts of the military are going to be more comfortable working with other actors than, say, for instance, with China, for instance. Some elements of Indonesia's intelligence community still have ties with Israel. There is just a deep pragmatism there for Indonesia, as is maybe driving other countries as well. And as Yohanes pointed out, one of those factors has been the arms embargo imposed by the United States after allegations of human rights violations in East Timor. And that has deeply scarred. I mean, we can say this comes back all the time, but it's not just the only factor. It's the idea that Indonesia wants to also develop its own domestic defense industry. And so it's looking for partners across the globe who can help invest in that. South Korea, Turkey, even nascent defense industry cooperation with Vietnam potentially as well, even though they might be competitors. But I think this is really interesting. There's a pragmatism there that's driving all of this. But Indonesia at this point can have this veneer of ideology as well. Like you said, the non-alignment, the Bandung spirit. There's a continuity there that President Prabowo can say, it's deep within our DNA that we're friends with everybody. And I found this statement that he made at one of the recent forums in Turkey. And he said, I want to bring Indonesia to a position of good relations with all the big powers so that we can be some sort of bridge and mediator. This is our effort. I mean, that's lovely. That's so sweet. But how's that going to work in practice? But I think, as Yohanes said, how that works in practice is that there's a different level of cooperation with each different actor, different ratio on certain key issues. And what that looks like is a spectrum of relationships with all major players: Japan, France, Brazil and something else, United States definitely in security, and so on and so forth, India and maritime exercises. And if that fails, if that veneer doesn't materialize into anything, they can just fall back on the pragmatism.
Do you think that is likely to change? Particularly thinking of the US relationship, for example. So now that we're seeing these different actions taken by the Trump administration that are sort of, I would say, destabilizing the broader sense of global order, whether that's around tariffs or it's around withdrawal of funding for aid, those sort of considerations, and seemingly a bit more sort of overt issue linkage between sort of trade measures and other foreign policy decisions. And you mentioned, Natalie, that there's this history from 25, 27 years ago with trade embargoes, and I guess we're now seeing a lot of Indonesian...
arms embargo.
Sorry.
Yeah, specifically arms embargo.
Yes. Yeah. Well corrected. Thank you. Arms embargo. And do you think that history and what we're going through now, do you think that is likely to shape the willingness for further cooperation with the United States at this moment? Or do you think that, I guess, the bigger state of international security is going to override that from a pragmatic perspective, as you say?
Yeah. If you look holistically at the Indonesia-America relationship, I think there are lots of different factors there. I think the United States seeming double standard with wanting to find peace and supporting different actors in the Ukraine-Russia conflict and then not standing up for human rights violations in Gaza have really impacted a particular generation of young people, not just in Indonesia, but in Malaysia and in Brunei as well, or in other parts of Southeast Asia. That's one thing to consider. What is the impact of the United States foreign policy globally on that generation? The second thing to consider is to what extent can the United States and Indonesia separate their economic and security relationships. I think Yohanes said just now, that a lot of Indonesian military, lots of different parts of Indonesia continue to want to work with the United States. There's a very strong security relationship. Many Indonesian military officers are trained at professional military institutions in the United States. So if that program is cut, then the United States will be shooting itself in the foot and then also cutting off a potential good source of that kind of PME to the Indonesian military. So if they can cushion the effect of the trade deal, or what's seen as coercion in some deals, because it's not really a trade deal. It's very, very lopsided if we look at what the terms of that deal have been between Prabowo and the American president. But the security relationship remains very important, very vibrant, very robust. And so, if those two can be separated, then they can continue to be a good relationship.
Yohanes, what are you seeing in the US-Indonesia dynamic at the moment?
Yeah, Natalie get it right. And I think there's a huge negative feeling from Indonesians, United States now. I mean, first is, of course, the fact that the United States seems to gung-ho in supporting Israel's humanitarian abuses in Gaza. I mean, if you look at ICS survey about public opinions of elite opinion in Southeast Asia, I mean, you can see the proof in the pudding, basically, the feeling to United States in Brunei, in Malaysia, Indonesia, literally collapse. the year before, like around 60% said, yeah, we are fine with the United States at the end. The number is always consistent. And then after November, after the Hamas Israel, and then it just collapsed. And then of course, when Trump also said that, okay, we need to impose tariff on Indonesia, there was a huge uproar on the social media. And when Prabowo signed up that 19% agreement, also same thing. Everybody said, oh, he's now bowing down to the United States. He's what kind of strong leader? The one that kissing Trump's boots, basically licking Trump's boots. So it was bad, and I'm really afraid that this will have, like Natalie said, this will impact the entire generation. That we need to start moving out from United States orbit. That we need to start looking at United States not as a benign hegemon that supporting this order, but that literally like a bully. And that really scares me, because I'm one of the who really push for more cooperation between Indonesia and the United States in terms of economy and security. And that's problematic.
And I just want to add quickly on that. It's not just what the United States is doing globally. It's some of its domestic policies as well.
Yeah.
Not long after there was the policy of randomly checking people and their visa status within the country, the Indonesian embassy in Washington issued social media posts saying that for all the Indonesian students studying at an American university, make sure you have your ID on you. If you feel like someone's approaching you, like you don't have to open the front door. Like, this is terrifying. If you're a university student, a master's student who's gone there on scholarship, your parents would be back home wondering, are you going to get snatched and thrown into a van and then ending up in some sort of detention center in the deep south? And that's a chilling effect that the United States doesn't need, particularly at a time when it's withdrawing a lot of its influence through think tanks, with the issuance of guidance that people can't attend think tank forums like Shangri-La Dialogue and things like that. That's a whole cascading effect that I think we're going to see. But so, yeah, it's the United States foreign policy overseas, but also it's domestic policy that's impacting this relationship with Indonesia too.
Not to mention the fact that Trump closed down the Voice of America, the US Aid, and what's the other one? Fulbright. It was literally what Natalie said earlier. Shooting itself in the foot, because USAID and Fulbright is very popular in Indonesia. Lots of Indonesians are taking Fulbright to study in the United States. Now, no more Fulbright. Then where are they going? They are going to China. They are going to Moscow. They are going to countries that's against United States, and that's basically destroying the entire generations. I got students, who told me, like a couple of years ago, they want to go United States to study at Ohio State where I used to study, or at whatever. Chicago, Harvard, all those great schools. Now, like Natalie said, the question is like, who's going to knock the door in the middle of night and take me away? And of course, that they don't have access to Fulbright and all those things. It's killing United States soft power, and I don't understand why they allow that. You also get Wilson Center was gutting out and whatever. It's crazy. I think. Okay. This is about Indonesia relations, so I'm getting off tangent now, but it's crazy.
Well, what I was going to ask, and sort of building on that idea, I guess, is where that leaves Australia, because I would like to think that Australia-Indonesia relations sort of exist in their own right, separate to what the United States is doing. But at the same time, clearly, as an ally of the United States and as close as we are to them, it does have, I think, to some extent, some sort of residual impact on the way that Australia is perceived internationally and the way that we relate to other states. And I think particularly when Southeast Asia has been hit so hard by Trump tariffs and things like that, it puts us in a delicate position. Now, of course, Foreign Minister Wong was over at the ASEAN Regional Forum Foreign Ministers meeting and was speaking about this relatively recently, and the Prime Minister's made remarks as well. But do you think, Yohanes, does this shape or impinge on the way that Australia and Indonesia relate, or are they viewed as quite separate things?
Here's the problem, I think. Indonesia has always seen Australia as United States' elder brother, or United States sheriff in the Pacific. So, and that's kind of one of the main reasons why the relation between Indonesia and Australia never really improved, because many people think that if you want to get somebody listening to you in Canberra, you better go to Washington first. Although one good thing, I guess, about Trump is that it allows Australia to differentiate itself from United States at this point, saying that, look, we are different. United States is pursuing crazy policy, but Australia is still having a good relation with Indonesia. I think that's a huge opportunity for Australia. But of course, the problem is, again, the trade relation with Indonesia and Australia is very low. And then there also, I always find it weird. Flabbergasting, the fact that when we had surveys to Indonesians elite or policymakers, whatever, and then we are asking and then they were asking in the Asia survey about who do you think is the best partner if aside of United States and China? Most of them choose either European Union or Japan. I literally keep screaming there's Australia next door. Why? Why do you think of European Union, which is half a world away, not somebody next door? But again, they keep telling me because Australia is United States' little brother, which I know is kind of stupid, but it is. So I think this kind of perception that Australia really need to be spared, and this is, I guess, kind of giving the opportunity.
Yeah, after all that US bashing, actually, we should probably look at the silver lining, which I agree with Yohanes. There's an opportunity. And I can tell you 2 quick ways I think Australia could really capitalize on what is, I hope, a temporary US withdrawal from a number of different initiatives. And the first is on gender, peace and security. So through some of the research that I've done about women's leadership in Southeast Asian militaries, I know that the United States had been responsible for funding several programs for supporting training and exercises for women personnel in the region. Now, particularly English language courses, which are instrumental in helping them advance in their careers by enabling them to do things like taking up positions in peacekeeping operations, which gives them invaluable field experience, which then helps them further their career. So there's a virtuous cycle there with just something as simple as English language training. I also know Australia provided that for many of my interviewees for one research project. So as the US has now pulled the plug completely on GPS, WPS, Australia, together with other partners, because Australia can never, have the sheer scale and size of resources that the Pentagon has, but we can, together with our partners, try and fill that gap. And that's a really important part of supporting what we see as women's participation in the workforce, particularly in the security sector. And I think people will remember that. And the second thing in a related way is, again, we're not going to be able to compete or replace what the United States has in terms of scale and size in its think tank ecosystem. But we can look at coordinating between our think tank ecosystems in Australia when it comes to our messaging about Southeast Asia. If what Yohanes says, I agree, what he diagnoses as maybe an image problem that we have, then how are we coordinating that message through our think tank networks that are plugged into think tank networks in Southeast Asia as well? Could we look at that as the US is pulling back? How can we then use that moment to then, maybe advance some of the similar kinds of values and support governance in Southeast Asia through a coordinated think tank strategy?
I think those sound like very, very intriguing prospects to me, Natalie. And I think it probably highlights in many respects the need, I think, for that kind of creative policy making in the Australian space, is that, as Yohanes, as you said, that there's not necessarily a lot of, say, economic complementarity, and maybe the sort of perceptions in Indonesia are more focused on bigger trading partners like the EU or Japan. And so Australia has to do things differently. We can't just rely on the way in which our economic complementarity with China has fueled that relationship, or our long-term alliance with the United States has underpinned that relationship as well. We have to do things slightly differently. And I think that's one of the things I guess I want to take away from our conversation is hopefully sort of helping people in Australia understand a bit better some of the complexity and dynamism and detailing in that relationship, because this is hardly an original thought on my part, but a lot of the conversation in Australia boils down to things like boat people and Bali, and then when things like the Russia sort of relationship flares up, that becomes the front page for weeks at a time. But actually, there's so much more going on underneath the surface there in a much more complex way. But in general terms, Natalie, like what do you think of, I guess, the present state of the bilateral relationship? Obviously, there are these areas we can do more in. There's more we can grow in, but I think there's been a lot of positivity around, say, the upgraded defence cooperation agreement in 2024. The Prime Minister's made it very clear that he views going to Indonesia as sort of his first international visit for both his terms as Prime Minister now. I mean, there's lots of those sort of positive signals being sent at the national leadership level. Do you think that does that sort of bear up to scrutiny? Is that an accurate reflection of that relationship, or is that at least accurate to the Australian perspective?
Yeah, look, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, from a very Canberra perspective, the relationship is in a relatively good state. We've got these upgrades in terms of defence cooperation, and then we now have invested our Southeast Asian economic strategy. So things are looking good insofar as we're turning towards Southeast Asia as well. But if you go beyond that into the human-to-human, people-to-people, community-to-community ties, we have some stuff going on, but it's not at scale. And I think there are, a couple of recommendations I would make there, other than on my wish list of having greater awareness of Southeast Asia within our schools, and then hopefully having that reciprocated with Indonesia. But that's not always the case. Indonesia has so many other greater immediate issues on its plate. But we ourselves, our new Colombo plan has been fantastic. I saw some of the figures this morning. In the 5 years between 2014 and 2019, we've boosted almost double the number of students studying in Southeast Asia. But the problem with that is that they're all short-term courses. A large percentage of the funding has gone to students studying either for 2-week programs or 1-month programs, and about 1% of those of the people funded are doing a year-long program, and there's about 10% doing semester long. So encouraging Australians, particularly young Australians, to stay longer in the region, I think would actually get us better bang for buck for the investment that we're trying to make in increasing this curiosity and interest in places like Indonesia. That's one. And then on a very, very grassroots way, the Australian government can look at the cost of visas for Indonesians visiting Australia. At the moment, it's $190 per person. If I want to go to Bali, it's $55. So if somebody wants to bring a family of 4, that's almost $800, which is a lot of money. So if you want to really increase people-to-people flows and have a good impression of people staying in Australia, you want people to come to their children's graduation at their Australian university, make it easier for them. And these are very, very simple things our government can do.
We'll be right back.
In this disrupted world, Australia needs security professionals more than ever. Join the next generation studying at the ANU National Security College. Our programs uniquely fuse academic knowledge with practitioner experience and fit around your lifestyle with study offered online and on campus. Follow the link in the show notes for more information about programs and scholarships. The ANU National Security College. Engaging minds for a secure Australia.
There's something that struck me only in the last week, I think, and this is maybe not national security, but it's still, I think, a good point of bilateral relations is in sport. And Robbie Gaspar, who used to play football in Indonesia and Malaysia and elsewhere, recently played a large part in getting a game together between one of the largest teams in Indonesia and the Western Sydney Wanderers from the A-League. This is Persib Bandung, I believe, is the Indonesian team. And I don't see why we shouldn't, whether that's with government help or not, but pursue things like, well, why doesn't every Australian team have a sort of a relationship with a team in Indonesia? And why don't we sort of have these sort of games at the beginning of every season, for example? But there are these almost society level aspects of the partnership that I think are ripe for boosting and for promotion, and that we might have a great government to government relationship. We have a really, at least judging from the video that he released, Prabowo seems very sort of chummy and personable towards Prime Minister Albanese and towards Australia, which is great, and we want to see those partnerships, but that only goes so far, and so we need to, I think, hopefully make that more holistic. And all these big international dimensions, will obviously shape what's possible. But there's so much more that happens at the local level as well. But Yohanes, I'll spin back to you at this stage. Is beyond those concerns that you mentioned before that some people have in Indonesia around Australia's relationship with the United States and how we might be perceived in, I guess, sort of the expert community who hopefully are sort of understanding all these different details and nuances. Is there a sort of a good perception or feeling towards what Australia's been doing with Indonesia over the last little while? Is there a positive spin on that relationship, or is there still viewed as a lot more that could be done?
Honestly, there are a lot of things, good things that has been done in the by Australia and Indonesia. I think there are more people to people engagement also, and many things that Australia did are highly popular, such as Bluey. I mean, my God, I mean, that dog is your best friend over the world. I mean, everybody I know, I mean, I got kids and all other parents are talking about Bluey. I mean, that's your best export, and it's crazy. I mean, the Bluey is crazy. I mean, everybody is working Bluey. Everybody I know, and so there are a lot of things that Australia can do to promote itself. I think in Indonesia. And but again, the problem is it's just not that much. That's a problem, and I agree with Natalie. There's a problem with the scope, with the intensity, with like how widespread it is compared to like China engagement. I mean, China is basically like throwing a lot and lots of money. I mean, they invited a lot of religious leaders in Central East Java. They went to China and went to Xinjiang and say, look, Xinjiang is nice. There's no problem in Xinjiang. Come on, I'll give you a guided tour all over the place. And everybody coming back and say, yeah, Xinjiang is nice. Nobody get persecuted. That kind of things is, I mean, that's the, I mean, you're basically fighting like a huge fire inferno with a garden hose. I mean, I think that's one of the big problem here. I think the intensity of the intensity of the engagement, I think, is pale compared to what China has been doing, or even Russia. Russia is now is, I mean, I'm in the WhatsApp group of IR scholars in Indonesia, and they basically getting lots and offers for Indonesian scholars to just go to St. Petersburg, go to Moscow, and we are welcoming you there. I mean, you don't have to pay those $180 Australian visa. Just come. We are paying you. I mean that's crazy about the outreach. I mean, and then I mean and I think that's what you have, but you are really up to. I mean, you have to understand that. And then of course, I mean, following what Natalie just said about about the Australian teenagers, youth coming to Indonesia, maybe first thing they should do is understand that Indonesia is not just Bali. I mean, Indonesia is not just Canggu, I mean, and Seminyak. It is like big, like lots of things outside Denpasar. So I mean, I think there are a lot of things Australia has been doing in Indonesia, a lot of great things, but it just pale in terms of intensity, and that's really worries me.
Are there any areas where you think there are major divergences between Australia and Indonesia, Yohanes, that would potentially undermine that effectiveness? So I think I take your point, and I think it's the same as Natalie's raised, that, or at least I interpret it that way, that there are lots of maybe areas that we can focus on that are quite tailored and quite specific, and get to sort of core points of the relationship. But of course, we can't deliver the sort of the scale of a China or even a Russia to some extent if by with those sort of approaches and the large scale sort of economic ties and cultural diplomacy. In that sense, we have to find different ways of doing things from Australia's perspective. But are there any blockages that you see that we need to overcome or work around?
I think the big problem, I see there are two problems due to major blockages, if I want to use your term. I mean, of course, there are many more, but I think there are two big problems here. First, the economic relations, I guess, is not as robust as you want to. Part of it because we basically produce the same thing. I mean, we produce coal, I mean, and raw materials. something that Australia is also producing, which makes economic relation between Indonesia and Australia is not as strong as we want it. I think if there are more economic relations, more intensity, then good other relations will follow. So, I mean, one of the main reasons why China's relation in Indonesia is very strong is because there's just a lot of businesses working with China. They keep getting lots of money from China. So it is in their interest to support good relations between Indonesia and China. And that's something that is not emulated in Indonesia-Australia relations because of the lack of in terms of economy. I think that's one of the big problem. And second is already mentioned this before, but there is always the feeling that Australia is United States sheriff in Southeast Asia. There's also trauma of what happened in East Timor. So it is an image problem, basically. I mean, if you ask me like how to solve this, short answer, I don't know. So I mean, like Natalie, I mean, we have been thinking a lot of like how to solve this, but it takes time. And it's just very difficult at it.
I think I would agree with that. I think definitely the second point Yohanes made about this image challenge that we've got, I think it even goes beyond that we have to be rather careful that someone with Prabowo, setting aside any potential hypocrisies and double standard exercised by the Indonesian president and his government, setting that aside, if there are any instances where Australia can look like it's behaving in any kind of proxy way in the United States or in any kind of colonial way towards the Pacific, or if the fact that it's very extractive relationship with Africa becomes more publicized, then we open ourselves up to being a punching bag for any kind of this convenient rhetoric that countries like Indonesia have and other countries like leaders of Burkina Faso, for instance, that have this Western bashing as a very helpful kind of rallying point for them, which has a bit of domestic cachet. We have to be careful that doesn't become weaponized. I'm not saying that it's likely to happen, but it could happen. And that's where Australia, I think, has this good opportunity, looking at whatever's happening in the United States now, to really forge our own identity, going ahead and recognizing Palestinian statehood, going ahead and acting in responsible ways and promoting that within our region. Those are really important things that I think that we could do, like I said earlier about the coordinated messaging, but it's what's the message that we want to send and making sure that we don't allow any kind of us being wrapped up into this like anti-Western, anti-colonial type of sentiment within the global South / global majority has any legs to it. And that's what I think we should look out for.
One thing that has struck me, both Yohanes from your comments and now from Natalie's as well, is how this connects with, I suppose, the specific approaches that the Australian government has taken over the last few years, and particularly the Albanese government in the last, I guess, since it's been re-elected. Is I think it seems to me that there's been more of an effort to create a level of, shall we say, rhetorical distance between the Australian government and the US government on a few topics. And you've also just mentioned Palestinian statehood is one very clear example of that. But even in, I think the language used by the foreign minister and the prime minister, to me, seems to be setting a bit of a, by no means a split, but just sort of pushing some of that rhetoric a little bit further apart and trying to set out a more uniquely, independently Australian outlook on the world and on the region. And of course, Southeast Asia has been a long-held interest for the Labor Party particularly, but it just feels a little bit more pointed to me at the moment than perhaps in the past. And I wasn't sure if either of you felt like that was, if intentional, making any headway or likely to be effective if the image still remains of the deputy sheriff mould and some of their language is maybe trying to separate Australia from that a little bit and stand a bit more on our own 2 feet in the region. Is that something that you've noticed as well, or am I just seeing things out?
No, I think we've kind of skirted around the idea of the role of China within Indo-Pacific, but I don't think we've grappled with the idea of how we're going to look as if we are by default part of an anti-Chinese American coalition, particularly if it comes down to joining any kind of treaty-bound response to, say, for instance, the takeover of Taiwan or an attack on the Philippines. And having a very frank and open conversation with our nearest neighbours about what does deterrence actually mean to them, how do they actually feel about US-China armed conflict, and where would we sit within that, noting that, unlike the United States, we are much closer to this region. We would be a site given the ramping up of our installations in Henderson and other places for assets that would be shared with the United States. There are great risks there, but I think our neighbours are also looking at these developments saying, yes, it's all well and good that our Prime Minister's gone to Beijing, but if it comes down to the crunch, Australia, you're going to be just on the side of the United States, and maybe that's not where we're prepared to be yet. So having these kinds of conversations now, I think, would help at the government-to-government level.
Yohanes, what do you think? Has any of this cut through, do you think, within the Indonesian system?
I hate to say this, but no, unfortunately, like Natalie said, the proof will be when the crunch time happen. Like, what will you guys do? I mean, that's the biggest question. And again, talk is cheap. Although Natalie may say it's expensive, but but there's a problem. I mean, when Albert, I think Albanese got lots of box check. I think he got it right. And actually, even Morrison, regardless how much you hate him, he actually do it pretty well. From Indonesian perspective, basically, he's saying the right things. But again, the problem is like, where are we when push comes to shove? Whether Australia will go back to United States as becoming their little brother again, later when Trump leaves the scene, or what happened? I think that's one commit. I guess, I might be wrong here, but I think the biggest question for Indonesian is like whether there is a commitment for Australia to actually be in Southeast Asia when push comes to shove. Whether Australia is an independent Southeast Asian country rather than a satellite of the United States in Pacific. I think that's one. I think that's one thing that I honestly don't have any answer. So it just because it just take forever to change the image, but I don't know. Am I making sense? I'm not sure I'm making sense, but but that's my feeling.
For what it's worth, I remain confident that we are a sovereign and independent actor with our own interest to pursuing the region, and I think, Natalie, as you said, we are resident here in a way the United States isn't, and so that's been the case since day one. If we go back through the sweep of Australian strategic history and thought, it's always been focused on Southeast Asia. From the 1940s and ongoing, and we have a long history of presence there, which I think spells that out. But
okay, can I jump in a second? The funny thing is, actually, Australia is one of the supporters of Indonesia. During the independence war between Indonesia and the Dutch, Australia has been very consistent in supporting Indonesian independence. That when we have this so-called Three Countries Commission, where Indonesia basically voted for Australia to be its representative in as a part of negotiating team against the Dutch. So there was this very close relation actually between 45 to 49, because Australia was one of the countries that actually supported independence. And honestly, I'm very surprised that it was not that much emphasized in the relationship between Indonesia and Australia. Of course, in the 50s, everything went belly up because Australia was supporting the Dutch in West Papua, and that's what I guess one of the main reason of the split, of the disappointment. But honestly, this is one part of the relation that between Australia and Indonesia that really needs to be focused on. They really need to be emphasized. I think it is very few people really know this, that Australia was boycotting the Dutch ships that coming to Indonesia. Australia was supporting Indonesia and United Nations and whatever else. This is part of a little bit of history that very few people really think about.
If only we taught more history in Australian schools. But yes, I completely agree with Yohanes.
In some ways, it feels a little bit like when we're looking at our relationship with Indonesia and looking at Indonesia's place in the world, I think to some extent there's almost like we're holding up a mirror of some sorts to ourselves, and it because of those, as we've just said, these decades of interconnectedness, both in terms of our literal diplomatic ties, but relationships and economic models and we have a continent, but Indonesia has this world's largest archipelago. We're all dealing with large maritime zones and complexities, and different parts of our history, I think, are shared and complex. And so I think that there's not really a nice, neat answer that we can sort of finish with that says, we've now we've solved Australia-Indonesia ties, and we've solved all the issues, we've found the right policy problems to address. But I think there is almost all the questions that we're asking apply equally to both parties, which I think is what makes it such a fascinating relationship and such a fascinating topic to discuss and to study. And so I've really valued your time with us on the podcast today, Yohanes and Natalie, for sharing so many of your thoughts and insights and contestations and provocations. So hopefully our listeners have taken that away as well, and a lot more for us to build on and work on in the years ahead. So thank you for being with us on the National Security Podcast.
That's my pleasure. Thanks, David. Thanks, Yohanes.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the National Security Podcast. We welcome listener feedback and suggestions at any time, so please get in contact at natsecpod@anu.edu.au. For more important conversations about Australia's national security, please subscribe to the podcast, our YouTube channel, and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter to receive the latest updates.